One thing, I've lived abroad for the last 4 years. And one thing that I've come to understand way better than, when I didn't live abroad is just how biased the media coverage is of other regions of the world. And I mean, I can speak directly to like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon because I've actually been there and experienced life there. But it's definitely given me a lens into like, into maybe not a lens, but it's definitely made me skeptical of anything else I read about other parts of the world when it comes to corporate media in the US. I mean, it's like shocking how backwards and sometimes untrue the things that you read and see are. Like it's to a shocking degree. It's like really disillusioning.
Well, we need to keep creating these enemies, and we need to keep manufacturing consent. I mean, and that's what we do with all these things. I had an epiphany years ago. I don't know, remember it was a picture I saw or something. And, I look at all of these countries and all of these people. These are just moms that are trying to get their kids from point A to point B without getting dead. That's it. Just like we're doing here, just trying to get by. And I obviously I relate more to it as from a mother's perspective when I look at places around the world, but it's anybody. These are just people. And so I kind of got away from the mindset of that othering a long time ago. It's just, it doesn't serve me. So I've gotten that a long time ago. And I have learned that our agenda as the imperial empire and basically trying to steal the world's resources is very self-serving, right? So anything we put out there is going to be to serve our agenda. I just feel the need to kind of get rid of that and do everything I can to expose that. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And I definitely have this audience of people that are sort of recovering neolibs. And it's true, because I am a bridge to, based on my demographic and my generation, I sort of am this bridge, and we are very nicely, slowly holding their hands and coaxing them over to the right, the correct side of things. But it is important. A lot of these people have been watching MSNBC continuously and have no idea that it's changed over the past 30 years.
Yeah. That's actually an interesting place to be, though. And it's an important role that you're playing, because I think that's another thing that, the left sometimes makes the mistake of doing. And when I say the left, I'm talking about this like very large, like umbrella term.
I know the nuance.
Right. So I don't mean to sound like I'm generalizing, but I think that's a mistake that we as a left kind of make sometimes, is this sort of expecting people to already be where you're at. So I think it's really important to be able to talk to people in a language that they can understand, especially if they're new to certain politics. And I think that's one really great example you mentioned, like coming at it from a mother's perspective. And it's a great way to explain like the impact of sanctions.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to ask you to do. Like, we hear the term sanctions. We do things like this to Venezuela. We do things like this anywhere where we want to cause an uprising. We do it. And I put that out there all the time. We do it with this strategy that will make the people so desperate that they'll rise up against their own government and support the person we want to put in to better our needs, right? I mean, and I see it clear as day. But can you, from being on the ground, explain what those sanctions look like to everyday people and how it affects their lives and how people can't get what they need?
Yeah. So when sanctions are described in the US media, it's often described as something that's targeting individuals. Like, we're not sanctioning the whole country. We're just sanctioning these like bad apples in the government that need to like change their behavior, right? So when you hear that, you're like, oh, that can't be that bad. They're just sanctioning some like corrupt people in the government. But actually, what happens in the US sanctions like entities or people in really vulnerable countries, right? Because it's always weak, vulnerable countries in the global South, is it makes financial institutions, international financial institutions, less willing to do any business in those countries. So if there's like 200 people in Lebanon that are under sanction, 200 people in like different entities, as a bank or as a pharmaceutical company, I don't want to risk US financial penalties. So I'm not even going to bother doing business with the country of Lebanon. Like, why even bother? I don't gain that much from it. It's a poor country anyway. And it risks so much, because if you accidentally violate one of the US sanctions laws, you can be liable for huge financial penalties. So what happens as a result of sanctions on countries like Venezuela and Syria and Lebanon and Iran, or Cuba or North Korea, is that like take like medical companies that deliver medical equipment, right? International companies that make dialysis machines are going to be less likely to sell those products and replace the parts you need to replace to maintain those products to a country like Iran, because they risk, there's just so many sanctions that they might violate. So a country like Iran then is unable to access replacement parts for dialysis machines. That, like, if your mom or dad is on dialysis, that's horrible, because at some point the hospitals run out and you're screwed. The same goes for medicines. There's all these like loopholes and exceptions that the US says exists for like medicine and food. But at the end of the day, these international companies don't really care. They're not going to risk it. So the entire, that's just like basic products. You want a replacement piece for your car. Maybe you're a taxi driver and you have a car part that needs to be replaced, but you can't get it because it's a German company. And now, your country is unable to import those products because that company doesn't want to be liable for sanctions. So that's one side to it, right? Is like infrastructure, people's personal belongings, and then also like infrastructure, like hospitals start to sort of break down because they can't replace things and buy things. On the individual level, it becomes an issue of when the US sanctions financial institutions in your country, it destroys your currency. Like completely destroys your currency and destroys your exchange rate so that the local currency becomes worthless, right? It decreases in value like tremendously. So maybe last month I was making $500 a month in Syrian currency, but now the Syrian currency has been so devalued that my income is now worth, $50 a month. That's what happens on the individual level when the US sanctions these countries. And it's like it's like a cookie cutter situation. It plays out in all these countries. What happens to a family is now my money is worthless. I have a harder time putting food on the table. The government has to cut subsidies because the government's run out of money to pay for subsidies. So now the price of bread has gone up. I can't send my kids to college anymore. And what future do they have anyway? The economy is destroyed. So now a lot of people who can start to leave the country. And so it leads to a brain drain. The professional class emigrates. They go to Europe.
With resources can leave.
Right, exactly. They apply for visas in Europe and Canada and the US. And so then this leads to this already poor developing country to lose its professional class, to lose its doctors, right? To lose its nurses. Right, exactly. At the end of the day, and then the country suffers.
Isn't that so? So in the way that it's done that, it's been very effective. Mm-hmm. It hasn't yielded the result that they're saying they want to use it for. That it's completely ridiculous. But it's been very effective in bringing countries to their knees and having them have to be sort of at our mercy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's what you see in countries like Syria. A decade ago, before the civil war started in Syria, was self-sufficient in medicine. It produced its own medicine, which is actually kind of, it's pretty rare for the Middle East for a country to be able to do that. It had a pretty booming, productive sector. Unlike
people don't know this. See, this is the thing. No. People don't realize that. We definitely have this image of the poor Middle Easterners stuck in the dark ages, and we're going to go over there and we're going to save them from themselves. We're just like we're bringing them freedom.
Yeah.
So yeah, how's that working out?
Quite the opposite. Yeah, not working at all. It's quite the opposite. I mean, in a lot of these countries, obviously there's a lot of problems. In countries like Syria, there was many problems in Iraq before the U.S. overthrew the government there. But that said, these countries did have like a functioning middle class. They had some of the highest literacy rates in the region. And, people had futures to look to. And now, what the U.S. does is it doesn't actually, it doesn't just overthrow governments, it collapses them. It collapses them so that they turn into these sort of like anarchist hellholes. Where like you would have a bunch of competing militias, which makes people actually long for the dictatorship that was overthrown. And you see that in places like Libya and Iraq.
I was going to say, that we've done so well in Libya. That's our branch for people who don't know, thanks to us, we now again have fully open slave markets in Libya. They're not even secret. They're just right there. That's thanks to us.
No, it's work. And that happened under a Democratic president, right? Like we brought back open air slave markets to what was once the most stable country in North Africa, all under the guise of like bringing democracy and, humanitarian intervention. And what's crazy is these narratives still work. Like I'm actually shocked that after like 2 decades of this, of destroying one country after another, there is literally not one country that we have intervened in that's become better as a result. Yet somehow
we're saying 2 decades. This goes back to when we first landed on this rock. I mean, we think that we're just like we're in charge of the whole world. And I think that when I talk about that to people, this concept of empire, and they almost look at me like I'm just sort of paranoid and very conspiratorial, like that's just such a dark way of, and I'm like, no, it's actually pretty true. I mean, we just sort of go like leeches around and try to suction everybody's natural resources. And if they don't want to be on the petrodollar, then we completely villainize them so that we manufacture our consent because they're lesser than us. And that way we can go and send our people there to help them. We're helping. I actually appreciated about Trump that he said, we're there for the oil. I actually, when he said that like months ago, I actually turned to the TV and I was like, thank you for your candor. I actually appreciated it. I'm like, yeah, we're there for the oil. And no one's ever said that before, but yet they act as if he's the only one doing it.
Right, but he says it out loud. Well, him and Neer tandem.
Well, but that is the one thing about anybody, even if I despise them based on their policy and their morality, thank you for telling me why we're there. I actually appreciate it.